Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer 1745 here with my starting a new playthrough of Hearts of Iron 4 with Black Ice, and we're playing as Japan. Okay, now couple of things starting off here. Haven't touched anything yet on this playthrough, so you can go through and see what I'm doing here. But I will say earlier today took me, I don't know, 3-4 hours, played through to 1938 and took out Japan. It was sort of an interesting game. It took out China. I was playing as Japan, took out China. Boy, that was a mess up. You get it live and unedited here. Well, not live, but unedited. That's because I don't have the time to edit everything. I took out China, but the interesting thing was China declared war on me. So it was an interesting fight. So it was just China, none of the other warlords, if you will, were involved in it. So I just took out China, so that made it a bit different. So that's good. One thing I will say I'm a little disappointed in is this. We already have our own faction here. I knew that Japan could have its own faction from our last playthrough with a slightly earlier version of Black Ice, but I didn't know it was pre-selected at the beginning of the game. I thought it was, you know, the national focus. You can go in and mod it yourself if you want, or obviously people like Black Ice modders can go in, and there's a file, sort of the historical path, that if you have checked, that will send the nation down a path of national focuses. If you don't select that, they're still weighted for likelihoods, but you can get very odd results if you don't have the historical path done. But it's really easy to go in and mod that too. So if you wanted to, say, have that as your first focus and it's not normal, easy to throw that into the historical path. So I'm a little disappointed. So we can't decide, because I don't know of a way to get out of a faction. There is a way to dismantle it, but I don't know that we're going to do that, to try to get in the Axis, which means it's a little different. But that's just one little sort of nitpick thing. Again, it could be modded, or I think we can dismantle the faction. But the problem I sort of foresee with trying to dismantle it is trying to bring some of the other faction members with me. So I don't know. So we have that. So we're limited on our starting focuses, what we can do. These two we can't do yet. There will be an event that will allow us to pick either one of these two paths. We have reinforced the Soviet border, expansion of the Zaibatsu, and spiritual mobilization. The Zaibatsu, I presume, is an industrial element. Don't really know of it. That's a very good one to do, but spiritual mobilization is also good because it will eventually lead to extra research slot here pretty quickly. We like that, and it's only 35 days. That's one of the reasons I'm not going with this first. It's always good to get things like some of these slots open and improved industrial research early on, but with only half the time. We're going to take this as our first national focus. Now we have a bunch of slots here. Let's go to some standbys. They're a little behind the usual German starting point. some of the basics. Now, let's quickly look at some of the, well, this is definitely something of a unique Japanese tree here, but some of these. We are going to research some here, but not many. It's not going to be our focus right away. One thing I did find is there isn't a good, at least I did not in my time come over a good starting foundation for a motorized division. Here we are pretty up to date for 36. We can quickly get 37. Increase that, but so we really don't need any of those. Here we are a bit more out of date for aircraft types. Not hugely. What we will do here is, since we are going to be looking at a war with China earlier on, we want to get some of these going so that if we're not as big an army, we'll be a better army than China. Fighters or naval bombers? Well, these early ones, we're going to go with these only 50 days. And another slot here. Pretty good for support unit types. I think we're going to go with operational integrity for Japan here. So let's go with that. Get some operation down. Now, I think before we start doing, well, let's get a couple of these going. We want to be able to fund our trades as well as our continued growth. Now here, we don't have a lot of resources, which really was, and I won't dwell too much time particularly now, but over the series on it, but was really sort of what was driving Japan in its desire for empire. Unlike Germany and Hitler's idea of living room, Hitler did to some degree, and I don't know how much it was talk and how much, you know, around the dinner table and how much was it hardcore philosophy. He definitely compared Germany to somewhat to America and America's expansion across the, you know, across the continental United States, across the North American continent at the time, because it wasn't obviously all the U.S. at the time, in stages. He definitely saw expanding Germany in stages across what was the Soviet Union to eventually the Pacific Ocean in his talks. I don't know how much of that was just talk around the dinner table, if he really thought that. He definitely was going to erase Poland from the map. That was clear, and he was definitely wanting to move in Germany into this, you know, the Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Russia, if you will. That's for sure. Japan never really I'm not the best expert on Japan. I did take 3 years of Japanese language in high school. Most of that skills are gone. Fully admit that. Little bits of it still remain. And so I sort of know Japanese history somewhat. There's never been a significant drive to export Japanese people to other places. Meaning, there was never a really big idea of colonizing Korea with Japanese people. there was, to my good knowledge, no real colonizing of Taiwan with Japanese people. Places here like in Okinawa, I would call them most assuredly ethnically Japanese, but they were conquered by different people at different times over Japan's history. So that, but in this time period, there really wasn't this colonization, expanding living room idea that the Nazis had. Now, they definitely did have their co-prosperity sphere, and the idea of definitely grew up to dominate the nations around it. There is definitely that, and that's politically, militarily, and other things. But the real driving factor for Japan was resources. That's what they saw as what they needed to do. So we need resources. Well, I really sort of would like to, as an interface thing, I would love to be able to just click on like Manchukuo here and get all of their resources all in one shot. But what we can do here is we're going to take this for we'll get 70 for one civilian factory. We'll get 73 steel. So we want that to feed our engines. We want the rubber for another factory. Don't know if we want their aluminum just yet. And we want their oil for sure. I want those. That'll cost 3 factories. But that will, yeah, we also want their aluminum. Just looking at how little there is. My first playthrough, I started out entirely avoiding. No, I didn't need to see. It needs to be better to be on aluminum. Avoiding some of these resources just because, or what I was producing. Let's get some uniforms, HQ equipment. I'm still not going to produce. I know these are out of date, but they have production efficiency starting, and we want that. Got a lot of ships in production. Just by their nature to have them here, they have to sort of have a factory so they ghost out. But what we're going to do is, as they come available, meaning as these get completed, to sort of concentrate production on a few to get that done. Okay, now you guys, if you're sort of getting bored of this, you can skip ahead a little bit. These are things I normally do off camera, but a few of you over different series have expressed that they want to see sort of my choices here to learn, maybe learn how not to do it, for in no way saying I'm perfect or the best. And okay, we have no cavalry equipment or horse transport, so we're going to do horse transport. Still somewhat saving resources, where they're going to kick up once the trades get through. And cavalry equipment. We have all of these cavalry divisions. Oh, please note the current flag. Depending on things, choices we make, it very well may be changing. No tanks at this time are we going to produce. I want to produce some heavy machine guns. Some submachine guns. Now, Japan really sort of came late to the submachine gun. Trying to remember here. I think it was later than this that they really sort of put their first submachine gun in production. Might have been as early as 38, but I don't even know if it was that early. They were sort of late to that, and it somewhat goes counter against the Japanese idea of warfare at the time. We want some amphibious assault equipment. One factory starting up is fine, I think, at the moment. That's because we're going to build up some marine units. The Japanese machine gun, if I'm remembering correctly, but we also need, remember, coastal artillery, don't we? We don't have that yet. Submachine gun was very much based on, if I'm remembering correctly, sorry, interrupting myself, on the German MP-18, which is the World War I German submachine gun, which was pretty decent. And the biggest problem with that gun was its magazine, which was the Luger snail drum magazine, which is notoriously finicky and notoriously very hard to load. The MP-28 was an update of that, simply converting it from the snail magazine to a double column, straight stack magazine, and they actually converted a lot of the MP-18s to MP-28 types. The British early on realized they too had lagged behind the submachine guns, and they scrambled to get a need, and they basically copied the MP-28. We called it the Lanchester. Basically, I think it was only the Royal Navy who ended up using them, because they come up with a Sten gun, which was much cheaper to produce, though not as good as a quality and effective. The Sten gun's really cool, but really sort of a crude, not that effective as in accurate. Okay, well I guess we've maxed out our current factories here, so that's what we're going to do now. We want to build make sure which, okay, let's train up 3 of these. I want to train up 1 of these now. No, I don't want to do the motorization just yet. Okay, our garrison divisions. I want to train up a couple of these. Just get them training here. Occupation duties, rear areas, that kind of thing will be helpful. Obviously naval invasions. Now you'll notice here, well, you'll notice a bit more soon, I think, that we don't have, we have shortages. So our production now, let's just sort of from placement management. Alright, well, that sort of starts us off. Now that we've had time for our trades to take effect, much better on the resources. Lagging in oil. Now, so Japan, obviously, as I was saying earlier, faced a shortage of resources, which it faces still to this day. It is geographically not the most resource-rich island out there, and to secure its resources, because in this time period nations very much looked towards autarkies, which were closed economic systems that can support themselves, that had a large enough resource base, large enough manufacturing base, large enough customer base to keep everything operating and contained within them. So with these prevailing philosophical beliefs by many nations, free trade is another sort of extreme, and there's a big world of difference between complete free trade and complete autarkies. Japan was worried about being able to get its resources now, so it, shall we say, indulged in bad behavior on the as what the international world would consider bad behavior, invading and conquering other countries, and they did it very, very brutally, with many atrocities. So their bad behavior caused other nations to, as a sort of a stick against it, because they really didn't want to go to war with Japan, started to limit trade and resources, which encouraged Japan to more bad behavior, but also showed them that they needed to develop an autarky themselves, or they would be constantly subjected to other nations' policies. Whether it's a you got to give independence to Manchuria or Korea, or just, hey, if you're, if a bunch of other nations around the world go communist, hey, you're still an imperial monarchy. We hate imperial monarchy, so we're going to put a trade barrier against them. So I mean, just purely on a shall we say, an ideological whim. If nations can control you, they wanted to be able to chart their own destiny. So I understand that. That doesn't excuse their bad behavior. It just gives an understanding of what they're doing. Okay, tank factory level reached as 1. Nice. So he gives a little bit of bonuses there. We have no subyards. Shipyards level 7. Japan is doing well there. So we have a 9.2% bonus or reduction in cost for building a bunch of ship types. No heavy aircraft factories. We have reached level 2, which is nice for there. No ammunition factories. Artillery factories level 2. No truck factories. Small arms factories level 4. Good. No uniform factories. Island garrisons. Okay. This is, we just got hit. Now we are also Green Army Command here. And the Japanese Air Force in Black Ice. This event is intended to provide both background information and the air arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army, as well as information about how Japanese aircraft work in B-Ice or Black Ice. Both the Imperial Japanese Army IJA and the Imperial Japanese Navy IJN had their own air arms during World War II. The divide between the two ran deep enough that even many of the companies that built aircraft were contracted exclusively to one service. In addition to carrier aircraft, the IJN developed its own land-based fighters and bombers. And we're going to go next because background information. This section is under construction. Okay. As Oh My God, who's sort of taken over Black Ice for Hearts of Iron 3, recently stated that maybe someday, soonish, meaning in a year or so, Black Ice for Hearts of Iron 3 may finally leave beta stage, in that they are no more planned development of, not yet, I mean they're still developing, but no more planned development of Black Ice for Hearts of Iron 3, and only just bug fixes. So this is something, if you're going to be a Black Ice player, you need to know up front. that Black Ice is constantly developing. It is not just, oh, we need to, we found a particular aircraft is overpowered, or, oh, we way underestimated or overestimated the either resources in an area or resources needed to build a particular type of thing, and making adjustments and fixes like that as time goes on. And it's not even just, oh, we found a true bug, an unintended problem somewhere, and now it's fixed. They are constantly working at adding more to the game, and this can be a real problem. With Hearts of Iron 3, you updated the game yourself. So I was constantly when working for Third Reich Events, when a new version was coming out, maybe just minor changes, but constantly needing to update things. And if I was playing my own game, I was often not updating that because I was 2/3 of the way through the game. The changes were nice, but not enough for me to start over again. Just keep going on. Now with the current system, and I think this is important to note, of auto-updating, I don't know if you can roll back versions of mods. I know you can roll back versions of the standard game, but you don't know if you can roll back versions of the mods. So what I did for the last Black Ice series was I copied over the whole Black Ice folder to another location and created a little temp mod file, the MOD file, that pointed to it to start it, to play that one, so that we had save game compatibility. The biggest save game compatibility for the last series was definitely on the front of Hearts of Iron, from 1.32 to 1.33. That is something I actually haven't done that yet sitting here today, but I will be doing shortly, is replicating that again. So if, say, next week there's a bunch of big changes to Black Ice and they're not save game compatible, I don't want to go back and start this game again. And so if you're looking at, you're going to play a game for more than, say, 2 weeks, you can get done in a game in a day if you want to sit down and play at a fast speed. But if you're going to be playing for any considerable amount of time, and Black Ice players often like to, you might want to think about making your own version of the current Black Ice to make sure save game compatibility is there throughout your game, so you're not halfway through, they've added something, it's no longer save game compatible, you got to start over. So just a warning there and something there. So this is sort of like, say, work in progress. Okay, game information. Black Ice adds many different units and technologies to Hearts of Iron 4 and can seem overwhelming at times. This guide is meant to help explain the differences and what they may mean to the player. Remember, the Japanese Air Tech tree tab is located in left column. Research, yes. Okay, currently the Japanese aircraft consists of the following: fighters, heavy fighters, I'm not going to read all of this, bombers. Japanese players will see historical naming scheme for the tech tree, while other countries will see only the Gatai short designations, the Allied code names designed so many Japanese aircraft during World War II. Currently, you might notice that there are some carrier aircraft that are placeholder units. These are a workaround to allow unique aircraft to work for the AI. Okay. Black Ice Japanese Air Technologies. It is not recommended or necessary to research all the air techs. Only research what you will be producing within the next year. Only produce what you will need. If you plan on striking against major powers, the investment in naval bombers and carriers and carrier aircraft would be prudent. If you plan on excuse me, on waging a long war against China, the Soviet Union, focusing on fighters and close air support would be a better idea. Okay, that brings up an interesting thing. they have created this very interesting state here. If you notice, it runs along the border. This is basically a state. Note, you see I can move here, can't move here. It's an early attempt at making a, and also here, because I can move into this part of Meijiang, but I can't come up into this province here again as a control, but the AI doesn't see that, so they are defending the borders. There's the new mechanic that creates impassable borders between regions that the AI will see as impassable and not waste units garrisoning it. This is basically the a demilitarized zone. Now there are events to remove this demilitarization. I don't know whether by event you can remove a impassable borders. So actually, let's increase the speed by 1. That I just quite honestly don't know yet. But I think it would be a, if you're going to do this, would be a bit more of an elegant solution. But this border was actually very passable up here. It was very, to my knowledge, primitive, so it should have a fairly high attrition rate if you're putting too many units there, but it was rather open. At least at the right seasons, the right times. Okay, preparation for the Winter Olympics. I don't think all of those should be news events spread across everywhere. The one notification of the Winter Olympics is happening, that would be great. And it's just fine that they're German-focused events. Let's just expand out and occupy the full border. Okay, spiritual mobilization. That's one thing that, and it is different. But one of the things that National Socialism and Japan sort of had in common was, in their ideologies, was a view of the will, if you will, using the word in two different ways, but the will to win, to achieve, to be victorious. Very much with National Socialism, they bought into the stab in the back theory of losing World War I, and that the main reason it was lost was that the nation as a whole lost the will to fight it. Now the Japanese spiritual mobilization, the warrior tradition, are very different than National Socialism's coming out of sort of Hitler, the will. Very different. They're both will-based ideologies, but trust me, they're, as a ideological viewpoint, they are very different. And from studying both, I can, I'm not going to go into it, but you can read up on the different ones. They're very different, but they do share that sort of core motivation that a sort of national mobilization will bring improvement and betterment to your country is very strong. Something that is very alien to the American viewpoint. So we're going to go with the student movement here, because we're trying to get to this extra research slot as quickly as we can. Now, of course, there was a sort of mass mobilization once the U.S. got into World War II. But before that and after that, they didn't have any sort of overwhelming goal, single-minded organization. Yes, you had the various government-sponsored elements that we're trying to get through, and I'm someday really want to get in and focus in that on the mod. Yeah, again, Winter Olympics. So just this would be fine. This one event should be fine. They shouldn't do all the rest of these for the news. You know, get through the Great Depression in the U.S. and different government programs to try to do that. And they definitely sort of had a, try to make some movies that would help people through the Depression and things like that. But it was nothing, no idea of a national unity in any sort of way, like similar to, and I'm not even talking in because like I say, they're very different between Japan and Germany's movements of the will. But if you look at America's expansion, it isn't like, oh, we all got to work very hard to achieve something together. This is one thing that people often, and I know I'm sort of going off on the side, but in the post-Stalinistic era, a lot of people that lived through elements of the Stalinistic era often acknowledged the, shall we say, terrible conditions that happened under Stalin. But in a way they really sort of loved it too, in that they were sort of all mobilized together to build a better society. And they talked about that, and where it was to some degree, I think, very much lost after Stalin died. Build this canal or build this railway through these harsh conditions, and so that they were sort of mobilized, forced to go off and do something. But it was for the, and again, it's a very different ideology from either Germany and Japan, so I'm not comparing the values of it, but the idea of a mobilization that we all have to go sort of suffer, much more suffering in the Soviet Union, suffering together as a community to achieve some great goal, that people look back fondly on it after the period and as being somehow very rewarding. Now I can see very rewarding needing to achieve stuff. They did under their Stalinistic methods, to me, is just horrifying. But and that you would look back on that as a whole and still have such fond memories of being sent off to these various projects. So there was, but in all of American expansionism, whether it's the Erie Canal, which was started basically before railroads really became a thing. They existed, but they weren't really a thing yet. This massive canal dug across the United States and across a few states or whatever. Sorry, my geography isn't the best, but through I think this is Lake Erie or something, or whatever. But but one of these big canals that they dug here. But that was all done, I think, with private money. I don't know if they even had the government condemn any land. I think they went out and bought, the canal builders bought the land from the landowners, but maybe they got government sort of forced. The government in the United States really can't take your property without paying you for it. Now, will they pay you the fair market value? That may be debatable, but if they're going to take property from you, even to, like, I don't know, build a secret Manhattan project, they still got to pay you for the land. They just can't come in and say, oh, this is ours now, get out. They got to pay you for it. Again, will it be what everyone considers fair market value? There's problems, and it's only supposed to be excuse me, used for the public good, for building a school or building a roadway or whatever. But they have to pay you for it. But I think the Erie Canal, and definitely most all of the railways in the early days, were entirely, they had to bid for the land. They had to convince by handing the money to people to give up their land for the railways. So all those railways and the Erie Canal, it was, basically hand dug. That was all, hey, we'll pay you to come out and do this. And, oh, you don't want to work here anymore? Well, you get to leave as soon as you want to. So if your living conditions weren't good enough, the food wasn't good enough, whatever it wasn't good enough, you were out of there. Now, of course, this was in the days before there was in America any form of social benefit. There were private hospitals that took care of people for free, meaning charity hospitals, but there were no government stuff. So if you didn't have a job, you starved. So it's not a perfect system. I'm not arguing that everything was wonderful then, but there was, what I'm arguing is the building of America and all of its railroads, all of, like I was talking to the Erie Canal, which is digging out a lot of stuff. And this was in the days before there was dynamite. There was black powder blasting, but so it's still a lot of manual labor, no steam labor, that they were doing these kinds of things entirely without government compulsion. So yes, you may need a job to eat, but if you could get a job, I don't know, chopping down trees for lumber or for firewood, or there was other competing conditions out there, that there was job. And of course you could always decide to you could get enough money together, and you had to sort of get some money together to be able to get food and whatever else to try to go out into the undeveloped parts of America. So you always had this choice in America of doing this kind of thing. And very much before the 1930s, there was basically no big government programs. Even the railway to link up East and West United States was entirely a private venture, and required them to pay the people willing to come. Now, coming from the Pacific side, from the west going east, they hired a lot of Chinese workers at very low wages with very dangerous conditions, I know. And so I'm not saying it was wonderful, but it was done without that sort of government compulsion, that sort of, we are in this together. It was much more of a free, developed society. And I would say, of the nations at the end of 1945, and who was the best developed and who was the best run, it was the U.S. So, you can talk about, and there's, good reasons. There's other ways to do things, but who won in 1945? Not just won the war, but who was thriving in a highly well-developed society that did not have the sort of much of the industrialization really sort of started in Britain and moved Germany and France. They were much more industrialized than the United States, both in total amount and percentages. The U.S. lagged behind, but it overcame. And if you want to talk about all kinds of natural resources and blah 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 that we're blessed with, okay, fine. Mexico's just about as good, quite honestly. They've got lots of well, they had half the United States or at one point, but even this part of Mexico is hugely rich in resources, and they've just never organized themselves up because they came out of the Spanish colonial model. That's just different. I know this is now a sort of a diatribe about this, but this is not about races. This is not about other things. This is just about how you organized your society together. That's all I'm talking about, is how you organize your society. Mexico, and trust me, I live in this part of the world. I know about Mexicans in Mexico. They're great people, but just the way they organize their society. There's a difference between an individual and the way the society is organized. But the way they organized their society did not have anywhere near the ability to grow and to develop that the way the U.S. did. And Texas, who was independent for a while, the Mexicans there overwhelmingly, and I do mean this, overwhelmingly, the Mexicans that were in Texas, when Texas got its independence, the Mexicans were overwhelmingly wanted to be part of this new Texas, because They saw that this was a much better way to organize the society than under Santa Anna, Imperial Mexico. And when the U.S. was all of, I think, like 6 days independent, it wasn't like 4 years or whatever for Texas. It was briefly independent. Again, overwhelmingly, the local Mexican population in California wanted to break away from Mexico as a government. And very clear that they wanted to. It's a very oddly shaped San Francisco Bay. Sort of a river that goes that way, but the bay doesn't. So that was a very popular movement. And this is not, again, about race, but it's about the way you organize your society. So this sort of freedom-oriented thing worked. Might not work everywhere, but it's a cultural thing. And so these other parts of the world just weren't culturally capable of doing that. Okay, let's see. So we've got our research finished there for that fighter. Now, the other thing I wanted to do here is, if you've watched my previous series, get the naval bomber going, because I want to do naval bombers now. Let's look at... I'm going to let these continue, because when I updated, these are currently the old carrier based, and these are the land based. When I updated them, they really jumped down in production efficiency. Now, as I said, we don't need to research all the intervening times, but this is the 36. After I get a pool of whichever one, these or whatever we're producing now, once I get a bit more of a pool of them, I will update them before I'm updating to here. So, because that's a 2-year gap, and that's just a bit long. So we'll do that soon. We'll get a pool of fighters up and going. And again, we don't need to see each one of those in the newspaper. That photo is not from remilitarizing the Rhineland at all. I'm something like that, maybe out of the Summer Olympics, maybe, but I'm really pretty sure that is almost absolutely sure, but not quite. But a couple of things are throwing me off there, but I'm pretty sure that is a photo from 1939, honoring the Condor Legion after their return. Germany kept, at least in a public sense, kept that it had the Condor Legion in both the ground and the air elements secret from the German people. It never made it into the press. They never acknowledged it internationally. I'm sure it was reported in other newspapers that there were Germans fighting in Spain, but they were always sort of technically, not part of the German army or Air Force, just that they were German volunteers or whatever. Where Italy very openly had troops wearing Italian uniforms in Spain. It's sort of hard to find photos of the Germans in too much uniform. But once the war was over, they held, and Franco won, they held a big victory parade, and they got all of the veterans from the war, or most all of them, and from 36 through to 39, A lot of them had been there just, I don't know, 6 months, a year, that didn't serve through the whole thing. But they got them all together, and they put them all into really nice, spiffy tan uniforms. You can see that guy there wearing, and that guy in that hat, I'm pretty sure. Unless those are Romanian army uniforms, I'm pretty sure those are with Goering and that Milch up in front, the Luftwaffe, and sort of a Luftwaffe thing mostly. There's great majority of them were Luftwaffe personnel. The army personnel were very small, but had them in their special uniform at parade and ceremony after acknowledging their existence and that they had been there. I'm pretty sure that's where that photo comes from. Obviously see it. Is that Reinhard Heydrich or somebody in an SS uniform there? Obviously they've whited out the swastikas, but I'm pretty sure that that's from... I just get interested in trying to identify photos. Okay, February 26th incident. On the 26th of February, a group of young military officers attempted a coup d'etat. The radical coup d'etat faction in the military assassinated several prominent politicians, but failed to assassinate the prime minister. The coup failed, and unlike the aftermath in the previous coup attempted, the surviving perpetrators were given secret trials and shot. So yes, I did research the Japanese government for figuring out ministers and whatever. Between the beginning of 36 and about 1940, the Japanese government is in a constant state of chaos, at least as from an American perspective. They're switching out ministers like crazy. We don't have the political power to even vaguely simulate how often they were switching out ministers. And there were various factions in the government. That's how that run. And part of it were various coups d'etat going on, and some of them were less violent than others. But so let's see: change faction popularity, fascist plus 30%, remove national spirit, radical factions in the IJA, add to infrastructure. Okay, we'll be seeing some more of this element coming up. Basically, the stabilizing factor eventually becomes Tojo himself, and he has 3 or 4 ministerial positions by the end of it that he's in charge of. Okay. Now, extra research slot. And so Tojo ended up taking over the government, closing ceremonies. There were changes to various government elements after Tojo was in power, but he focused and centralized the power around himself. And often, like I said, from memory, it was 3 or 4 ministries that he was in charge of, but functionally outside of sort of the prime ministership and the army, those were the 2 ministries he held most securely. The others were basically his deputies, ran everything. He was just appointing the deputy. Okay, rapid growing Japanese fascist movement has never claimed that they needed majority support before they seized power. Now this, in my opinion, is wrong. There were 1 or 2 fascist movements in Japan. None of them ever got anywhere. They were, they might have gotten a few people elected to parliament, but literally like 1 or 2 seats. The fascism never took hold in Japan. Japan was not fascist. Not in any of the ways we would. Now, those of you in America may have heard of this. I don't know how much overseas you may have heard of this. This is a new Antifa movement, sort of short for anti-fascist, but it could also be anti, using the FA, First Amendment, meaning they don't like speech that they don't like. And one person made, and I haven't used it yet, but sort of a meme or whatever. It has, the political spectrum as a, a up, down, left, right kind of thing. Basically, the upper left corner is green, and everything else is fascist. So the modern anti-fascist movement. Donald Trump's a fascist. No, Donald Trump is not a fascist. He does nothing that's fascistic. Okay, I'm sorry, he is not a fascist. He's a big government conservative maybe, but he's not a fascist. So if you're using fascist like the old Soviet Union or whatever, the fascist, that everything that wasn't them is fascist. Okay, and this was sort of the propaganda that was used for, quite honestly, most Americans at the time and to this day, simplistic identifiers that once we were at war with Japan, they called Japan fascist, but Japan was not fascist. Its economic systems were organized nowhere like fascist economics were organized. You go into some other areas, but it just really wasn't. It was a militarist society, most assuredly. It was an authoritarian society in government, and becomes much more so, because leading up to this period there was sort of a growth of democracy within certain frameworks. None of the basic democratic movements, to my understanding, had any ability to have any sort of, whether that as an individual or not, I don't know, but as any sort of public policy in the sense of, oh, let's get rid of the emperor. I mean, they had none of that. Okay, they were maybe starting, in the early 30s, a sort of a imperial democracy, maybe to some degree, again with limitations. And they, around this time, but some of it, like you say, saw earlier, there were moves to more militarized government. So a militarized government, and without trying to pull, and I don't know right off the top of my head the different faction names in Japanese, they don't necessarily hold the description that we would hold, but they're definitely not fascist. So, but I will sort of grant, I wish they would had changed that to militarists or authoritarianists, though within the sort of simple political spectrum, yes, they've added monarchist here. And Japanese imperial identity is at a minimum monarchy on steroids. This is going to be a longish episode, but it's sort of good for the first. I hope you're enjoying this. Recently I was posting, and they're talking about the Death or Dishonor coming DLC, which with Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And there's various monarchist elements within those things, and as I post, monarchism as an ideology today is on the rise. You can disagree with that, as either, and some people are disagreeing. I'm wondering whether they don't like monarchism, or they don't think it's on the rise. I think it's on the rise. I think it's clearly, that doesn't mean I think it's becoming the majority viewpoint in some of these European countries. Far from it. But from what it was, say, I don't know, in 1970 to what it is today, support for, a lot of countries, Belgium, Denmark, they have a king or a queen or whatever, but in many ways they don't have any real government function. They're just sort of, I think a lot of people may have been looking on them as a quaint old tourist attraction. around back then. But really sort of, like I say, I do believe monarchism is on the rise. Again, I'm not saying it's a majority viewpoint, but I don't really think any of the modern monarchists want to return to absolute monarchy of Louis XIV's France, you know, where it's basically the king's whim. I don't think anybody's thinking that we want anything like this. Now, the level of ideological viewpoint for the absolute monarchy of Japan, or no, of France, under Louis XIV, let's say give it a level of 4 for reverence or whatever, respect of the monarchy. The belief at this time in Japan and before this time, the level of reverence and belief for the Japanese emperor would be a level 10 compared to the level 4 of Louis XIV. But the emperor at different times, because I've again studied Japanese history, at times he had literally almost no control, to a point of sort of being held hostage in a sort of in a city, in a grand palace, sort of like the Forbidden City in Peking, Beijing, Beiping, however you want to say the title, in the sense that, you know, he lived within this wonderful palace with all the traditions, but the Japanese feudal warlords, the daimyos, and eventually developed into the shogunate through the Civil Wars period, various Civil War periods through Japan. The Civil Wars were never against the emperor. They were against the various feudal warlords. So although the emperor was this sort of godlike figure within Japanese society, he didn't necessarily have the absolutist control, or anywhere near the absolutist control that Louis XIV had. So if you're looking at political control, the Japanese monarchists generally had a lot less control than like Louis XIV. But reverence of person, reverence of ideology, and the, shall we say, embodiment of the nation in a human being, as opposed to a flag or a symbol of something that sort of comes out of the American tradition. You know, we revere the flag, not because that flag is so precious, but that flag represents the U.S. We don't look to our our president does represent the U.S., but when you have a British standard, a British flag, national flag, and the Queen's there, you dip the British flag so it touches the ground, and is not just touching the ground, but is laid flat on the ground into the dirt. I mean, that's sort of the salute to the Queen. With the national colors, you put the national colors into the dirt. You would never do that with the American flag for any reason. I mean, that's just in any sort of ceremony. I mean, if the flag staff falls over, that happens, but not as a part of a ceremony. So no president or other national leader is above the flag, if you will, as the symbol of the nation. Trying to keep it out of modern politics here. But so, yes, the president is a symbol of America, but he isn't the symbol. It's the flag that represents us. You can look at the, you know, the Iwo Jima, the flag, that staff that sort of falls over that you see them putting back up in the famous photo and statue. That's just because it fell over and they were putting it back up. So you have, you know, it's sort of that is different. So it's embodied in a person. So the Japanese emperor has this status, but it's very sort of different. And so the monarchist party in some way doesn't work, because the emperor has, I'm trying to, how to best say this in short, sort of has certain levels of approval, trust me, and they sort of did a whitewashing on it, but the emperor approved Tojo and Tojo's plans. He wasn't somebody held hostage by Tojo and Tojo's fate. Had early on the plans of you know, going to war in China, going to war with the U.S. Had the emperor really objected, he could have objected and gotten rid of Tojo. He very well could have done that. But there wasn't this ideological, hey, the emperor should run the government. He should pick his team to put as cabinet ministers. And he should be the one that if don't like what they're doing, he should hire and fire them and doing all this stuff. Like that you found often in European monarchies, particularly like in the 18th century where I've studied a bit more. Sometimes in Britain as the 18th century is going along, the prime minister and the different ministers, departmental ministers, were sort of decided to some degree as more and more by majority rule in the House of Commons, Parliament. But in other countries, less so. And if you go back to the 17th century, it was the king's party. The king was actively trying to run the government. The Japanese emperor never really got into that level of that. So that's sort of a little misleading. There's, as one of the sense, and notice there isn't a Japanese name for this party, monarchist, because they're really, to the best of my, and I don't, right, I'd have to look these names up, but obviously I can see, democratic, communist, fascist, and whoever this neutral party is, but they really weren't that sort of setup. So hopefully that wasn't too boring. Okay, so before they seize power, counting on uniting the nation under their leadership once their rule is established. However, it seems their public support has grown rapidly. Many fascists are now calling the emperor a hypocrite, claiming to represent the wishes of the people while turning a deaf ear to the masses who want to set the Empire of Japan on the path of greatness. The call for a referendum has been dismissed as a typical attempt at disrupting the system by monarchist members so far, but at least it's a political measure. If we do not act now, the fascists may choose the violent struggle for a better path to power. Okay. Like I say, there was no fascist movement. There was no fascist party of any note. I have to look up to see who some of the fascists were, but and I did do this, I just don't remember the name. And they were people that were putting in, had been in the West, and were really trying to get public motivation for fascism. This is militarism, as I would call it, not fascism, but definitely much more authoritarian than a parliamentary democracy, which it was in a limited way. Okay, so we're going to lose 100 political power if we suppress this hateful movement, change popularity of fascists down by 10%, which it currently is the majority here at 56%. And we will have a year of fascist revolutionaries, which will gain negative 10% national unity. Our current national unity is 70%. Okay. Our fascist party will become the ruling group. We will gain a base national unity of minus 5%. Or we don't pay attention to them at all, and we just get negative 10% national unity. I'm going with this one, which I think that matches the history. But notice here, we still have the emperor, but we've changed flags to the imperial war flag as opposed to the more peaceful state flag, I guess. And so because we are going to not conquer the world, this isn't the goal of this game, but we are going to build the Japanese Empire as an aggressive empire, so that's why we went down that path. Well, let's pause this here. I want to thank all of you for watching. I really do mean that, and I want to thank you for liking the videos. It does sort of help its visibility, and I really want to hear from you on any topic that I've discussed. I like to know who the viewers are. It helps me to talk to you better, how much you know about subjects. If you have questions about something that you want me to cover more in the future, if you're confused. Confusion doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means I didn't explain it well, because I'm just sitting here BSing while I'm playing. And yes, I do label this sort of commentary because I don't have the historical facts in front of me when I'm talking. So, love to hear from you, help to get to know you better. Post questions, comments, suggestions, ideas. I don't know how long we're going to keep this series up. Basically, if viewing numbers start to go down too low, I will switch to another Hearts of Iron series. But if this numbers stay high, we will go through this basically until the Hearts of Iron 4 1.4 Oak patch comes out, and of course we will also have the DLC of Death or Dishonor. Once that comes out, and then likely, because we'll likely be playing Black Ice again, because that's just, I like it better than the regular. When I go back and test the regular stuff, I just miss a lot of the Black Ice stuff. And wait for a Black Ice update to get to the next patch and DLC expansion integrated into it. So at that point, the plan is to change probably again back to Germany, because I've got a lot of requests for it. I even had a few requests to immediately go back under this and start playing Germany again, because I want to do it with Death or Dishonor, because it does focus on a lot of these nations that interact heavily with Germany, and trust me, they interact heavily with Germany. It'll be a key nation to play. Whether we do some shorter series playing as some of these other nations, I don't know. That you'll see in that DLC. They're officially calling it, and not an expansion, country pack. But so I want to do that there, so I didn't want to immediately jump into that. It was a close run thing with Italy, and then Britain was also suggested, and some other small countries, but I think Japan is enough different that this will hopefully be interesting. Presumably we'll at least conquer China or something. I don't know how much of the Pacific and all will do, and that just sort of how quickly things come out. So just to give you sort of a roadmap of my current plans. Look, I play this for testing and for fun. I don't need to play it as commentary, so if not enough people are interested in any one of these series, even some of my non-Paradox series, if the numbers go down, I put the series sort of on hold or end them or whatever, because, you know, I don't need to talk to an empty room, if you know what I mean. So, again, thanks for watching. See you next time for more Hearts of Iron.